The morning of January 8th, 1966, dawns with the deafening roar of hundreds of helicopters tearing through the sky over the Hobo Woods. This is the beginning of Operation Crimp, a massive American offensive designed to crush the Viet Cong military headquarters hidden somewhere within the infamous Iron Triangle. 8,000 heavily armed infantrymen prepare to descend into a hostile jungle environment, confident in their overwhelming firepower. The objective seems straightforward to the generals back at the command center. They plan to trap the enemy, force a decisive battle, and eliminate the communist stronghold completely from the map. As the largest air assault since the Second World War unfolds, the sheer scale of the operation creates an artificial storm of rotor wash and flying debris. Troops leap from the hovering metal beasts, immediately establishing a tight cordon around the designated target zone to seal all potential exits. The sweeping formation begins its systematic advance through the dense vegetation, ready to unleash a firestorm upon any resistance. Every soldier expects a brutal firefight against entrenched communist forces desperate to defend their command node. However, the jungle remains eerily quiet as the advancing line encounters absolutely nothing but empty foliage. By mid-morning, the advancing American patrols stumble upon their first significant discoveries scattered throughout the dense undergrowth. Instead of fortified bunkers or mass troop formations, they find small, concealed holes perfectly camouflaged against the muddy jungle floor. The initial assessment treats these as standard spider holes, simple fighting positions meant for solitary snipers or quick ambushes. The textbook procedure is immediately enacted by the confident squad leaders. Soldiers drop fragmentation grenades down the narrow shafts, wait for the muffled explosion, and call in combat engineers to collapse the entrances with heavy demolition charges before moving forward. The tactical illusion of superiority shatters when the expected results fail to materialize despite the massive application of high explosives. A patrol returns to a previously destroyed spider hole, only to find the explosive charge merely scratch the surface of something much deeper. Frustration mounts as commanders authorize heavier munitions, cratering the jungle floor with massive blasts that only reveal more indestructible shafts. Within a few hours, the sweep teams report discovering over 50 separate entrances clustered within a single square kilometer. The troops realize they are not dealing with isolated foxholes, but something incredibly complex. American combat engineers deploy their specialized equipment, pumping massive volumes of concentrated tear gas directly into the gaping black holes. They expect the toxic smoke to force the choking enemy combatants to the surface, but the gas simply dissipates through hidden ventilation shafts scattered miles away. Desperate to crack the subterranean defense, they pour thousands of gallons of water into the network, hoping to drown the occupants in a muddy tomb. The water drains away instantly into unknown depths, swallowed by a subterranean abyss. The enemy has vanished beneath their heavy combat boots. 2 days into the massive sweep, the stark reality of their failure begins to settle over the frustrated American command staff. 8,000 elite troops, supported by tens of thousands of pounds of high explosives, have achieved absolutely nothing of strategic value. The immense firepower doctrine that defined modern Western warfare proves entirely useless against an enemy that refuses to fight on the surface. But here is what nobody knew that morning. Beneath the Hobo Woods lies a city, an expansive fortress carved entirely out of the dark earth, rendering aerial bombardment useless. Observing the mounting chaos is Captain Mike, an Australian Special Air Service liaison officer who brings a different perspective to the battlefield. He watches the Americans waste their immense resources trying to smash an invisible target and realizes the fundamental flaw in their entire approach. "You are treating this like a bunker you can eliminate with firepower, but it is a network," he tells the exhausted American briefing officers. "Networks have logic, choke points, and central nodes." His words challenge the very foundation of the operation, demanding a drastic shift toward calculated intelligence gathering. Captain Mike draws upon classified intelligence gathered during the brutal jungle conflicts in Malaya, recognizing the distinct communist signature in these defenses. He explains that if the Viet Cong possess an extensive tunnel system, someone must map it to find the critical vulnerabilities hidden within. The American commanders listen with growing skepticism, knowing that sending men into unknown underground mazes is practically a suicide mission. "What if they go underground?" Mike asks, forcing the room to confront the terrifying reality that their 8,000 soldiers are merely walking on a roof. The proposition to map the network is met with heavy silence, as everyone visualizes the claustrophobic nightmare of crawling into the earth. It requires specialized men willing to spend agonizing hours exploring dark passages that might collapse or be fiercely defended by unseen guards. The Americans admit they lack the specific training and psychological conditioning required for such extreme confined space reconnaissance missions. With all conventional options exhausted, the desperate command staff approves the radical plan and formally requests the assistance of the Australian special operators. Corporal Bob Carney, a seasoned Australian operator, stands at the edge of a newly discovered hole disguised brilliantly as a living termite mound. The camouflage is so perfect that the enemy actually incorporated an active insect colony into the muddy structure to fool passing patrols. Bob stares down into the vertical shaft, feeling the cold air rising from the depths, smelling of damp earth and ancient secrets. He realizes that the immense destructive power roaring above him is utterly meaningless against the silent, suffocating darkness waiting below. Preparing for the descent, Bob strips away his bulky standard combat webbing, knowing the narrow passages will trap any excess gear. He carefully checks the action on his Browning pistol, his only defense in a space where rifles are impossible to maneuver. He clicks on a small, fragile flashlight, its weak beam quickly swallowed by the oppressive blackness of the vertical drop. Captain Mike places a hand on his shoulder and issues the final order to find out exactly how deep the rabbit hole goes. A nearby American soldier mutters that he wouldn't go down there for $1 million. Bob looks at the pale American soldier and casually replies that it is a very good thing nobody is offering that kind of money. He ties a thin safety rope around his ankle, establishing a primitive communication line where 3 sharp tugs mean an emergency extraction. With a final steadying breath, the corporal lowers himself feet first into the claustrophobic shaft, leaving the bright jungle sun behind him. As his boots touch the hard-packed soil 3 meters down, he steps out of the conventional war and into an underground realm of pure terror. Bob's boots hit the solid earth floor, and he instantly finds himself forced onto his hands and knees. The ceiling of the horizontal passage hovers barely 70 centimeters above his helmet. Pressing down with the immense weight of the jungle above, his small flashlight beam cuts through the absolute black, revealing smooth, hard-packed clay walls that angle slightly to defeat thrown grenades. This is no crude dirt hole, dug by desperate insurgents in a hurry. He notices sturdy wooden supports spaced at precise intervals, indicating highly professional engineering designed to withstand immense surface pressure. The subterranean passage branches out into 3 distinct directions, forcing Bob to make his first critical navigational choice. He selects the right-hand path, slowly dragging his body forward while counting his agonizingly slow paces to build a mental map. The stagnant air down here is incredibly thick, carrying a heavy, organic scent that smells of damp soil, old sweat, and something disturbingly close to rot. As he inches forward through the claustrophobic tube, his shoulders constantly scrape against the narrow earthen walls, reminding him that a sudden cave-in would bury him alive without warning. After 10 grueling meters of crawling, the suffocating tunnel suddenly opens into a wider subterranean chamber spanning 2 square meters. Bob cautiously rises into a crouch, swinging his dim flashlight beam across the expanded space to check for hidden threats. The pale light reveals woven sleeping mats pushed against the earthen walls and heavy iron cooking pots resting cold in the center. Looking up, he spots a cleverly angled ventilation shaft punched through the ceiling, designed to disperse smoke invisibly into the dense jungle canopy above. The enemy had been sleeping here only hours ago, moving his light along the cavernous walls. The lone Australian operator discovers deeply carved Vietnamese patriotic slogans celebrating communist victories. He carefully pulls a compact camera from his breast pocket, snapping vital photographs of the abandoned living quarters for the intelligence analysts. This undeniable evidence of long-term, permanent habitation contradicts every assumption the American generals hold about the nature of the local insurgency. The Viet Cong are not simply visiting this area to stage ambushes and flee. They have built an entirely self-sustaining subterranean community beneath the heavy boots of the oblivious American infantrymen. Leaving the sleeping quarters behind, Bob chooses another branching passage that leads him even deeper into the sprawling underground complex. The ambient temperature steadily rises as the oxygen thins, making every drawn breath feel like pulling hot cotton into his burning lungs. He breaches another chamber and freezes as his light illuminates rows of rudimentary bamboo beds and scattered surgical instruments. Small glass bottles of scavenged antibiotics and blood-stained bandages confirm he has just walked into a fully functional underground hospital. This hidden medical facility proves the enemy is deeply entrenched and prepared for mass casualties. The corporal presses onward through the labyrinth, dragging his aching body toward another excavated room containing a makeshift industrial workshop. He discovers heavy metal lathes, scattered mechanical tools, and discarded brass casings used for manufacturing deadly mortar rounds and booby traps. The sheer logistical effort required to transport this heavy machinery piece by piece down into these suffocating depths is absolutely staggering. He photographs the weapon-making tools, realizing that the American artillery dropping high explosives on the empty surface are completely missing the actual industrial heart of the Viet Cong war machine hidden securely below. Bob has been crawling through the oppressive subterranean maze for 20 nerve-wracking minutes when a sudden sound stops his heart completely. It is not the rumble of American bombs or the shifting of loose earth, but the distinct murmur of human voices. Vietnamese words echo softly down the dark corridor ahead of him. Entirely conversational in tone and lacking any sense of alarm, he immediately kills his flashlight, plunging himself back into a terrifying, absolute darkness where his only remaining connections to the world are his raw hearing and the cold steel of his pistol. Lying frozen in the pitch-black tunnel, Bob faces a horrifying tactical dilemma that would break the nerve of an ordinary soldier. He is entirely alone in a severely confined space where his firearm is heavily restricted and maneuvering is virtually impossible. If he engages the unseen enemy forces here, they possess every conceivable advantage in their own meticulously designed environment. The Viet Cong know this twisting layout intimately. They can navigate the intersecting passages in total darkness, and they can easily collapse the surrounding tunnels to seal the lone intruder inside a permanent earthen tomb. Despite the overwhelming strategic disadvantage, the Australian operator's primary mission remains critical reconnaissance, meaning he absolutely must know what lies ahead. Gripping his pistol tightly in his right hand and keeping his darkened flashlight ready in his left, he resumes his crawl. He inches forward with agonizing precision, testing every millimeter of soil before shifting his weight to avoid making a single sound. The conversational voices grow steadily louder, echoing against the hard clay, accompanied by the faint, flickering glow of a subterranean lantern spilling out from a wider chamber just a few meters away. Bob slowly drags himself to the jagged edge of the illuminated passage and carefully peers around the earthen corner. The chamber ahead is vast, measuring 5 meters square and tall enough for a grown man to stand completely upright. He watches in absolute stunned silence as at least 12 armed Viet Cong soldiers sit casually in a circle, eating bowls of warm rice. Their lethal assault rifles remain stacked carelessly against the dirt walls, entirely relaxed as they enjoy a communal meal inside their impregnable fortress, completely unaware an enemy ghost is watching them breathe. His finger lightly rests on the hair trigger of his heavy pistol as his mind races through the grim survival mathematics. He can kill maybe 3 before they react, but then he's trapped with 9 angry VC between him and exit. A sudden firefight in this enclosed cavern would be deafening, chaotic, and inevitably fatal for the lone, unsupported Australian scout. Shooting now would sacrifice his life for a minor tactical victory, entirely destroying the precious intelligence he has meticulously gathered regarding the true, terrifying scale of this massive subterranean communist command center. Exercising immense combat discipline, the corporal makes the incredibly difficult decision to slowly back away from the illuminated chamber inch by inch. He moves in absolute agonizing silence, controlling his rapid breathing until he retreats far enough into the dark passage to safely turn around. Bob painstakingly crawls back through the suffocating labyrinth, mentally tracing his exact route, counting every intersecting branch to build an accurate map. When he finally emerges from the termite mound 45 minutes later, the waiting American infantrymen stare at the pale Australian operator as if he has just resurrected from the dead. Captain Mike immediately pulls his exhausted scout aside and quietly asks the crucial question that will alter the entire military campaign. Still covered in the clinging grave dirt of the underworld, Bob delivers a chilling intelligence assessment that changes everything they know. It is not just a bunker or a temporary hiding spot, he explains to the stunned commanders. It is a sprawling city. He reveals that the subterranean network spans for kilometers across multiple levels, hiding hundreds of occupied chambers, and proves that the mighty American army is currently standing helplessly upon an indestructible underground fortress. Within hours of the chilling debriefing, the entire scope of the military operation transforms drastically. General Seaman's command staff finally realizes they are dealing with something completely unprecedented in modern warfare. The enemy has literally gone underground, neutralizing the massive American aerial and artillery advantages. The strategic problem is clear. How do you fight what you cannot see, cannot target, and cannot locate? Recognizing the futility of blind destruction, the generals officially approve Captain Mike's radical proposal to systematically map the sprawling subterranean network. Over the ensuing 36 hours, the small contingent of 23 Australian SAS operators conducts arguably the most dangerous reconnaissance mission of the entire war. Working in tightly coordinated pairs, these highly specialized soldiers systematically enter the twisting tunnel systems at multiple discovered access points. Stripped of their bulky combat gear, they carry only small-caliber pistols, dim flashlights, waterproof notebooks, and compact cameras. They are deliberately moving through suffocating, narrow passages that have not seen the light of day in years, entirely exposed to sudden enemy ambushes. Before descending, the specialized teams establish rigorous protocols for navigating the absolute darkness without losing their minds or their lives. Communication is strictly limited to tactile signals and gentle tugs on the safety ropes to maintain the element of total surprise. Each soldier acutely understands that firing their weapon in the confined space will cause permanent hearing damage and instantly alert the entire subterranean complex. The heavy psychological burden of willingly entering a buried coffin requires a unique breed of soldier completely devoid of normal claustrophobic human instincts. As the intrepid operators push deeper into the subterranean abyss, they discover expansive subterranean chambers that simply take their breath away. Deep beneath the jungle floor, they stumble upon a massive underground hospital equipped with 30 bamboo beds. The medical facility is still heavily occupied by wounded Viet Cong fighters who scatter in absolute panic when the ghostly Australians suddenly arrive from the darkness. The sophisticated medical infrastructure proves the communists are prepared to sustain massive casualties while defending this critical, deeply buried command node. The architectural wonders of the Dark Realm continue to unfold as the scouts map further interconnected branches. They locate a functioning industrial factory equipped with heavy metal lathes and specialized tools explicitly designed for manufacturing deadly mortar rounds and explosive booby traps. Nearby, a fully operational printing press churns out stacks of anti-American propaganda pamphlets meant to demoralize Southern forces. Everywhere they look, there is undeniable evidence of long-term human habitation, confirming this labyrinth is a permanent, thriving city rather than a temporary defensive bunker. Stepping into the enemy's intimate living spaces, the Australian operators uncover a profoundly human side to the invisible communist fighters. The earthen walls of the sleeping quarters are adorned with precious personal items, including faded photographs of distant families and deeply emotional handwritten letters from home. Beautifully carved wooden decorations sit proudly on dirt shelves, attempting to bring a sense of normalcy to the suffocating darkness. This is home for these dedicated fighters, engineered with remarkable sophistication and an astonishing level of architectural forethought and mechanical ingenuity. The surreal intimacy of these occupied spaces deeply unsettles the hardened special operators, blurring the clear lines of conventional warfare. Seeing the beautifully carved wooden toys intended for distant children makes the invisible enemy feel disturbingly human and agonizingly relatable. Yet, they meticulously document these emotional vulnerabilities, knowing that military intelligence values comprehensive psychological profiles just as much as logistical weapon caches. Every discarded letter and family photograph is carefully collected, providing the Allied command with unprecedented insight into the highly motivated minds of the communist resistance fighters. The immense survival capabilities of the underground fortress rely on brilliant, invisible engineering that baffles the surface commanders. Complex ventilation shafts are perfectly disguised from the surface, cleverly blending into natural termite mounds to completely hide the exhaust from cooking fires. Fresh drinking water is ingeniously drawn from diverted underground streams, ensuring the subterranean population never has to risk surface exposure. Massive communal chambers are heavily reinforced with thick timber supports, explicitly designed to withstand the crushing shockwaves of continuous American heavy artillery and aerial bombardments. Further exploration reveals highly advanced sanitation systems that prevent deadly diseases from ravaging the densely populated, deeply buried communist community. Deeply excavated latrines are strategically placed far from the fresh water sources and sealed with heavy clay covers to trap toxic odors. The sheer logistical discipline required to maintain strict hygiene among thousands of people living in total darkness is a testament to their fanatic dedication. The Australians realize they are not fighting a ragtag group of desperate insurgents, but a highly organized, heavily disciplined subterranean military society. The paranoid defensive architecture is specifically designed to trap and disorient any invading surface forces brave enough to enter. The labyrinth features numerous false chambers heavily rigged with lethal explosives, deliberately created to fool searching soldiers and collapse upon them. While mapping a seemingly dead-end corridor, Corporal Mike discovers a concealed trapdoor revealing a steep passage descending into a totally separate second level. The stunned operators realize the tunnels are incredibly layered and deeply three-dimensional, multiplying the sheer volume of the underground city exponentially. Navigating this three-dimensional nightmare requires intense spatial awareness, as the steep connecting shafts are deliberately curved to prevent easy access. Small, heavily camouflaged firing slits allow hidden Viet Cong sentries to shoot upward into the main tunnels while remaining completely protected themselves. The Australians must meticulously probe every shadow and suspicious earthen bump, constantly expecting a lethal bamboo spear or a tripped fragmentation grenade. The exhausting mental strain of anticipating imminent death from every conceivable angle drains the operators far faster than the stifling physical heat of the deep tunnels. Descending into the deeper secondary level, Corporal Mike carefully breaches the absolute nerve center of the sprawling communist fortress. He cautiously enters the primary command center, finding sophisticated tactical maps pinned meticulously to the reinforced earthen walls. Heavy military radio equipment sits beside classified operational documents scattered frantically across a large wooden planning table. Half-empty cups of warm tea rest near the paperwork, indicating the high-ranking occupants had fled into the deeper shadows mere minutes before the Australian operator breached their highly secure subterranean sanctuary. Maintaining strict combat discipline in the hostile environment, the operator works quickly to photograph every critical detail of the command center. He urgently grabs the sensitive classified documents, stuffing them into his pockets before carefully initiating his tactical withdrawal. He moves backward through the darkness, knowing fully armed Viet Cong sentries are probably watching his every move from heavily concealed side passages. They are patiently waiting for him to make a single fatal mistake or step on a hidden wire before he can successfully leave their labyrinth. Meanwhile, another paired Australian team discovers a heavily reinforced storage cavern packed to the ceiling with massive quantities of stolen rice. The cavernous room contains enough preserved food to sustain an entire communist infantry battalion for several months without requiring surface resupply. They also find mountains of captured American ammunition and stolen medical supplies, ironically turning the immense logistical wealth of the United States against its own soldiers. The subterranean fortress operates as a massive, secure logistical hub, directly fueling the deadly insurgency, ravaging the contested surface world above. When the exhausted Australian teams finally return to the surface, the aggregated maps they create reveal something absolutely shocking to the American command. The meticulously charted tunnel system aggressively extends over 25 kilometers, containing more than 300 distinct chambers layered across multiple subterranean levels. With over 50 verified entrance points scattered throughout the jungle floor, the complex probably shelters over 2,000 heavily armed communist fighters. It fundamentally proves that the mighty American military has spent days bombing the roof of an indestructible underground metropolis. This terrifying intelligence finally explains the most frustrating tactical mystery the American forces have faced in the brutal regional conflict. It clarifies exactly how large, heavily armed Viet Cong military units seemingly vanish into thin air whenever massive American infantry battalions sweep through a contested area. The communist fighters do not magically vanish into the dense jungle foliage. They simply retreat into their impregnable underground sanctuaries. They comfortably disappear beneath the heavy combat boots of the American soldiers, entirely negating the overwhelming technological superiority of their Western enemies. The sheer scale of the surveyed complex completely demoralizes the American engineers who previously thought they could simply flood the tunnels. The intricate drainage systems and varying elevations mean that pumping water into one entrance merely redirects the flow into harmless underground reservoirs. Even utilizing heavy bulldozers to crush the surface would only destroy the uppermost defensive layers, leaving the deep command centers perfectly intact. The fortress was specifically designed to absorb and entirely negate the massive technological might of the world's most advanced military superpower. As the American generals review the painstakingly drawn subterranean maps, a profound sense of strategic helplessness washes over the crowded command tent. The intricate diagrams reveal a highly sophisticated enemy infrastructure that renders their massive 8,000-man surface cordon completely meaningless and utterly ineffective. The Communist forces could theoretically march entire infantry regiments right under the American defensive lines without ever being detected by surface patrols. The realization that their massive air assault had essentially captured a useless roof while the enemy thrived below is a bitter pill to swallow. Captain Mike points out that destroying the extensive tunnel network using conventional explosive methods would require an unimaginable, utterly impractical amount of time. Even if the American engineers managed to collapse every known surface entrance, the resilient Viet Cong would simply dig fresh exits overnight. The deeply buried infrastructure gives the Communist fighters total control over when, where, and how they engage the heavily armed American infantry forces. The Australian liaison officer insists that a fundamentally different, far more intimate approach is required to permanently neutralize this unprecedented subterranean threat. The harsh reality of this subterranean warfare completely shatters the fundamental doctrine of American military dominance based on overwhelming firepower. The enemy forces possess secure sanctuaries safely beneath the earth where they can comfortably stay for weeks, heavily supplied from hidden logistical caches. They remain perfectly protected from the heaviest artillery barrages, simply waiting patiently in the dark for the frustrated Americans to eventually leave the area. You absolutely cannot bomb what safely exists beneath the earth, forcing a desperate reevaluation of the entire military strategy. However, during their agonizing hours mapping the suffocating darkness, the brilliant Australian operators discover something far more valuable than simple geography. They realize the enemy's psychological state while living underground is fundamentally different from their cautious behavior during surface combat engagements. In tunnels, they feel safe, protected, invulnerable. Because tunnels are sanctuary, and that psychological assumption is a vulnerability, the Viet Cong let their guard down, cooking meals, sleeping soundly, and relaxing completely, blindly trusting the thick earth above to protect them from the horrors of the war. This profound psychological revelation quickly leads the Australian commanders to conceptualize the most disturbing and controversial phase of the entire military operation. If Allied forces can successfully penetrate that assumed sanctuary, they can make the enemy genuinely fear their own impenetrable fortress. By weaponizing the terrifying darkness against its own architects, the special operators realize they can break the communist fighting will in ways massive aerial bombing never could. This sinister tactical shift prepares the exhausted Australian troops to descend back into the abyss, no longer as scouts, but as hunters. Day 3 of Operation Crimp marks a terrifying turning point deep beneath the Hobo Woods. The Viet Cong soldiers, who have been confidently retreating into their sprawling subterranean sanctuary whenever the American forces approach, begin encountering something completely unexpected. Death has suddenly manifested in the absolute darkness of their own home. It starts silently, far away from the massive explosions rocking the surface above. The impregnable fortress, previously a place of absolute security and comfortable routine, is about to become a suffocating tomb of psychological horror for the communist fighters hiding within its depths. A seasoned Viet Cong soldier named Tran moves cautiously through a deeply buried, highly familiar passage. He knows this specific route intimately, having traversed its narrow confines countless times to bypass the heavy American artillery strikes above. As his dim flashlight beam sweeps across the hard earthen floor, it illuminates a thin wire stretched tightly across the corridor at ankle height. Tran freezes instantly, recognizing the deadly signature of a hidden booby trap. But this is definitely not a standard communist defensive measure. Someone else has meticulously set a lethal trap for the master trappers. Tran carefully steps over the taut wire, his heart pounding violently against his ribs as he continues forward with extreme caution. 20 meters further down the pitch-black tunnel, at a major junction connecting 4 intersecting passages, his trembling light falls upon a horrifying sight. He finds the lifeless body of Ka, a fellow soldier who was supposed to be on strict sentry duty. Ka lies motionless in the dirt, his throat expertly cut from behind, with terrifying precision. There is no sign of a struggle, indicating the lethal strike was entirely unexpected and completely silent. Staring at the lifeless body of his comrade, Tran realizes with absolute, suffocating horror that someone is hunting them in their own tunnels, someone who moves in darkness as comfortably as they do, someone who kills silently. The devastating psychological impact of this grim discovery immediately shatters the foundational belief that the deep tunnels are perfectly safe. The unseen Australian operators have successfully penetrated the supposedly impenetrable communist sanctuary, fundamentally transforming the secure environment into a terrifying nightmare where death patiently waits around every dark corner and behind every earthen pillar. Following the successful mapping phase, a small, highly specialized Australian SAS team formally requested permission to conduct what they clinically described as disruptive operations underground. The tactical concept was brutally simple but incredibly dangerous to execute. If the Viet Cong forces currently feel completely safe living inside their subterranean tunnels, the Allied forces must aggressively make them afraid. The elite operators prepared to enter the claustrophobic darkness, not merely to draw maps, but to actively hunt human targets. They would weaponize the paralyzing darkness to systematically dismantle the enemy's deeply ingrained psychological comfort zone. Moving like phantoms through passages in absolute darkness, the specialized hunters relentlessly locate hidden Viet Cong positions. They expertly utilize their recently acquired knowledge of the complex tunnel layout to accurately predict enemy sentry locations. Approaching entirely in silence from behind, they efficiently eliminate isolated guards without firing a single alerting shot. They meticulously set devastating booby traps in busy corridors that the Viet Cong previously considered absolutely secure. The deliberate intention is to rapidly create an overwhelming climate of paralyzing fear, forcing the communist fighters to constantly doubt the safety of their own home. Frustrated by their embarrassing inability to effectively root out the elusive communist forces from the surface, American commanders eagerly approved this brutal subterranean campaign with minimal administrative oversight. What happened next in the suffocating blackness heavily depends on exactly who tells the historical story. The sanitized official military reports merely describe limited tactical engagements and standard defensive skirmishes. However, the hardened veterans later described 3 terrifying nights of continuous, intimate underground operations. Small, lethal Australian teams relentlessly hunted seasoned Viet Cong fighters deep within their most cherished and previously invulnerable subterranean sanctuary. To maximize their tactical advantage, the ruthless Australian operators even utilized captured communist uniforms to get incredibly close to their unsuspecting prey. Wearing the distinct black pajamas of the enemy allowed them to briefly hesitate a sentry in the dim light, gaining the precious seconds needed to strike a fatal blow. They utilized absolute silence and unmatched stealth to slip past heavily guarded junctions, navigating the twisting labyrinth with a terrifying predatory grace. They systematically killed seasoned Viet Cong fighters within the very passages those soldiers had comfortably used for several continuous years. Decades after the brutal conflict ended, one veteran speaking completely anonymously accurately described the sheer terror of these hunting missions. "We were in a narrow passage on the second level," he recalled quietly. "It was pitch black, and we had been 6 hours entirely underground. We suddenly heard distinct voices ahead of us, 3 VC soldiers talking softly. We could actually smell their pungent cigarettes burning in the thick air. We moved closer, slow as death itself, terrified that a single misplaced hand or shifting knee would instantly give away our lethal position." The veteran detailed the agonizing tension of the final approach in the total darkness. "When we were barely 2 meters away, I suddenly switched on my heavy flashlight, aiming the blinding beam directly at their faces. They were completely blinded, frozen in absolute shock. We knew we only had 2 seconds before they would effectively react and return heavy fire. We fired 3 rapid, silenced shots, dropping them instantly, and then plunged the tunnel back into complete darkness. We moved immediately to a pre-identified side passage to completely avoid the inevitable chaotic counterattack. Crouched in the hidden side passage, the Australian operators listened intently to the violent aftermath of their sudden, deadly strike. We waited and quickly heard running footsteps, frantic shouting, and pure panic echoing through the dirt," the anonymous veteran explained. "The responding enemy soldiers were completely disoriented in the dark. They simply didn't know how many of us were down there, and they didn't know which direction we had fled. We stayed perfectly silent for 20 agonizing minutes, letting their fear multiply, before we slowly moved deeper toward another high-value communist target. The devastating psychological impact on the targeted Viet Cong fighters was exactly what the brilliant Australian strategists originally intended to achieve. Within just 2 days of launching these intimate subterranean attacks, newly captured communist prisoners began reporting bizarre and deeply unsettling rumors. They claimed that seasoned Viet Cong infantrymen were suddenly refusing outright to enter certain deep tunnel sections. The terrified prisoners genuinely believed these specific dark corridors were actively haunted by vengeful spirits. They whispered nervously about invisible ghosts who moved silently in the absolute darkness, killing their strongest warriors without any warning. Driven by this escalating paranoia, local communist commanders desperately attempted to restore order within their rapidly fracturing subterranean ranks. Some military units aggressively began posting multiple armed sentries in previously secure inner passages, hoping sheer numbers would deter the invisible assassins. However, this reactionary defensive measure severely reduced their overall offensive operational capability. It tied up hundreds of valuable combat fighters in menial security roles, significantly reducing the manpower available for vital surface combat against the heavily armed American infantry forces. The Australians had successfully destroyed the psychological sanctuary the deep tunnels previously represented. The deeply ingrained assumption of absolute safety was fundamentally shattered, entirely replacing comfortable security with a pervasive, paralyzing dread. The hardened communist soldiers could no longer sleep peacefully in their earthen beds, constantly terrified that a silent Australian ghost would slit their throats in the dark. They could no longer walk confidently down familiar corridors, eternally fearing hidden tripwires and devastating booby traps left by the phantom operators. The very intricate architectural design that once protected them from massive American bombs had now become a terrifyingly claustrophobic trap, directly facilitating their own agonizing slaughter. The claustrophobic environment heavily amplified the sheer terror of this intimate warfare, making every creeping shadow a potential lethal threat. A dropped tool or a sudden cough echoing down the long earthen tubes was enough to trigger frantic, blind gunfire from terrified communist sentries. The Viet Cong fighters were slowly turning on their own sanctuary, exhausting themselves completely through constant, paranoid vigilance. The relentless psychological pressure orchestrated by the silent Australian hunters achieved far more strategic disruption in 3 short nights than thousands of tons of high explosives dropped blindly from the American bombers above. When the massive American military offensive, known as Operation Crimp, officially ended on January 14th, the Western generals eagerly claimed a decisive victory. They proudly pointed to the 500 enemy combatants killed on the surface and the discovery of the sprawling tunnel network as clear evidence of strategic success. However, the real, lasting impact of the controversial operation was entirely psychological and hidden deep underground. The Australian SAS had successfully transformed the impregnable communist fortress into a haunted, terrifying nightmare, proving that no sanctuary was truly safe from the encroaching shadows of war. Captured communist documents discovered several months later revealed exactly how deeply this psychological warfare had fractured the enemy command structure. Senior Viet Cong officers issued strict new tactical orders regarding subterranean defense. The extensive tunnel systems, previously hailed as the ultimate revolutionary achievement, were officially declared no longer secure from Allied infiltration. Commanders ordered their exhausted troops to rotate sentries frequently and mandated the constant use of multiple shifting passages to avoid fatal ambushes. Most importantly, they ordered strict guards posted at every single subterranean junction to prevent the terrifying phantom assassins from moving freely. The most telling piece of captured intelligence was a direct order to completely avoid any deep tunnel section where Australian special forces had been previously reported. The profound fear generated by a mere 23 men armed with pistols and flashlights had successfully denied the communist forces access to their own meticulously constructed infrastructure. The dark tunnels that were once hailed as an impregnable revolutionary sanctuary had abruptly become a terrifying tactical liability. The intricate subterranean city was now widely recognized as a cursed place where sudden death frequently came from the suffocating darkness completely without warning. This radical shift in communist military doctrine vividly demonstrated the sheer power of targeted psychological terror over conventional explosive destruction. The immense American war machine, with all its helicopters, artillery, and infinite logistical wealth, had merely scratched the physical surface of the dense hobo woods. In stark contrast, The small Australian infiltration teams had directly attacked the very soul of the enemy's defensive strategy. They proved unequivocally that superior psychological tactics could successfully achieve strategic dominance even within the enemy's most secure, heavily fortified, and intimately familiar subterranean terrain. As the surviving Australian special operators finally climbed out of the suffocating darkness for the last time, they left behind a fundamentally altered battlefield. They had successfully conquered the mythical underground city, not by collapsing its sturdy earthen walls, but by thoroughly poisoning the minds of the men hiding within it. The legend of the phantom killers moving silently through the pitch-black labyrinth terrified the hardened Viet Cong fighters, far more than any massive B-52 aerial strike ever could. However, this unprecedented, intimate victory in the shadows would demand an incredibly heavy toll from the victors. The exhausted hunters blinked painfully in the blinding tropical sunlight, their lungs desperately pulling in the fresh, uncontaminated jungle air. They had successfully hunted the deadliest trappers in the world inside their own lethal maze, emerging victorious from a realm previously thought entirely unconquerable. But as they quietly packed their specialized gear and boarded the waiting extraction helicopters, a profound, lingering silence settled heavily over the victorious operators. They had gazed too deeply into the absolute darkness, and the terrifying things they had done in the shadows were already beginning to quietly haunt their own minds. It is now February 1966, precisely 6 weeks after the conclusion of Operation Crimp, and Corporal Bob Carney sits quietly in a brightly lit briefing room at Nui Dat. He is officially supposed to train a group of fresh, eager arrivals on the highly specialized tactics of tunnel clearance, but he simply cannot focus on the task. A profound exhaustion weighs heavily on his slumping shoulders, born from terrifying nightmares that completely rob him of any restful sleep. These are definitely not typical combat dreams filled with roaring artillery or chaotic surface firefights that standard infantrymen usually experience. Instead, the veteran operator finds himself repeatedly trapped in absolute darkness, frantically navigating suffocating earthen passages that infinitely twist back on themselves. He constantly hears phantom voices whispering in the black void that might be the enemy, deceiving echoes, or perhaps something far worse lingering in his mind. He is entirely unable to escape the crushing claustrophobia that aggressively tightens his chest every single time he simply closes his eyes. Bob quickly realizes that he is not alone in his silent suffering, discovering that his fellow operators share the exact same debilitating, unspoken terrors haunting their restless nights. The grim reality is that 17 out of the 23 elite Australian operators who participated in the underground operation actively report severe sleep disturbances. They experience crippling anxiety whenever placed in confined spaces and suffer from aggressive, intrusive thoughts that shatter their daily concentration. This silent epidemic occurs long before post-traumatic stress disorder is officially recognized or properly treated by military medical professionals. The suffering soldiers are dismissively told by their superiors that they are completely fine and simply need a little time to properly adjust back to the normal routines of standard surface military operations. But the disturbing truth is that something about fighting in those buried tunnels fundamentally broke something deep inside them. Military historians and psychologists consistently struggle to fully capture exactly what made this specific subterranean combat environment so exceptionally damaging to the human mind. The absolute suffocating darkness immediately triggers deeply ingrained primal fears that surface combat simply cannot replicate. The severely confined space creates a crushing claustrophobia, constantly amplified by the paralyzing awareness that the heavy earth above could instantly collapse, burying them alive in a lightless, forgotten tomb where nobody would ever find their crushed bodies. Furthermore, the terrifying knowledge that the unseen enemy knows the twisting passages far better than they do creates an unbearable, persistent psychological tension. The utter impossibility of tactical retreat amplifies the danger, but the absolute worst factor is the horrific intimacy of the killing itself. One veteran accurately described that in a regular surface firefight, there is usually a protective physical distance between opposing forces. You are mostly shooting at vague shapes hidden in the distant tree line, shielding your mind from the brutal reality of taking a human life during the chaotic heat of open battle. However, in the suffocating tunnels, whenever you directly encountered a hostile soldier, you were terrifyingly close enough to physically touch them. The operators saw the wide, terrified eyes of their enemies, clearly heard their frantic, heavy breathing in the dark, and then killed them at point-blank range. That horrific, inescapable intimacy permanently stains the human soul and firmly stays with you forever. Another major compounding factor was the complete inversion of normal combat rules, stripping away everything a highly trained soldier relies upon to survive and maintain their psychological stability during a massive, violent military engagement. On the surface, a surrounded infantryman can frantically radio for heavy artillery support, execute a tactical retreat, or utilize the surrounding terrain to gain a crucial defensive advantage. But in the deep tunnels, especially during these aggressive offensive operations, you are entirely alone and completely isolated deep within hostile enemy territory. There is absolutely no fire support, no medical help coming, and zero option for a safe retreat. The operator is left utterly isolated in the dark, forced to carry a crushing psychological weight that slowly grinds down even the most hardened and disciplined Special Forces veteran. Beyond the intense physical danger, there is another incredibly profound dimension to this trauma that is rarely discussed in official military histories. The severe moral ambiguity of deliberately hunting human beings inside their own sanctuary creates a devastating internal conflict. Entering the expansive Viet Cong underground complexes meant aggressively moving through their private living spaces and seeing their intimate personal effects. The operators stared at cherished photographs of distant families, read deeply emotional letters, and then brutally killed the occupants right inside those intimate spaces, entirely shattering the standard boundaries of conventional, honorable military combat engagements. This disturbing intimacy created a severe moral complexity that many brave operators intensely struggled to reconcile with their own humanity. One anonymous veteran solemnly confessed that they were professionally trained to fight armed enemy combatants on a traditional battlefield, but in the dark tunnels, they were doing something fundamentally different, essentially invading private homes, because that is exactly what those subterranean complexes represented. The veteran vividly remembered breaching one specific chamber and finding beautiful children's drawings plastered on the earthen wall alongside hand-carved wooden toys, a sight that completely shattered his perception of the invisible communist enemy. The veteran recalled the horrifying realization that they were expected to quietly set a lethal ambush right there in that very room. They would wait in the absolute darkness for a father to return to those carved toys, and then they would mercilessly execute him. "That is definitely not standard combat," he whispered tearfully. "That is something else, entirely." The Australian High Command eventually recognized this severe psychological toll, quietly rotating most of the original tunnel operators back to standard surface duties shortly after Operation Crimp concluded, but the devastating mental damage was already permanently inflicted. The grim statistics of this hidden aftermath paint a tragic picture of the true cost of this unprecedented subterranean warfare. 17 of the 23 elite men officially reported severe psychological issues upon returning to base. 4 of these exceptional soldiers were eventually medically discharged from the armed forces due to their broken minds. 3 more voluntarily left the military entirely within a single year, desperately trying to escape their trauma. Tragically, 2 veterans died by suicide years later, an outcome never officially connected to the military but clearly understood by their grieving families as direct combat casualties. Despite this horrific personal cost, the brilliant tactical lessons learned in the dark fundamentally shaped Australian military operations for the rest of the brutal war. They unequivocally proved that a deeply entrenched enemy could be systematically defeated through superior psychological dominance, not just relying entirely on overwhelming physical firepower. They demonstrated that even the most secure underground sanctuary could be violently violated, turning the enemy's own defensive architecture against them. Fear was officially proven to be a weapon just as terrifyingly potent and strategically effective as any modern rifle, artillery shell, or massive aerial bombardment. This staggering realization triggered a massive butterfly effect across the entire communist military command structure. 6 months after the conclusion of Operation Crimp, a senior Viet Cong regimental commander named Nguyen Van Hai wrote a highly classified tactical assessment. He declared that their previously invincible tunnel systems must now be considered extremely vulnerable. He officially recommended drastically reducing their reliance on the underground complexes and strictly avoiding the establishment of critical headquarters within compromised subterranean zones. A single senior commander was fundamentally changing the entire military doctrine because of what 23 Australians did in 72 hours. Yet, despite the undeniable strategic success, Numerous haunting questions remain entirely unanswered to this very day. What exactly happened to the hundreds of Viet Cong soldiers killed deep inside the tunnels during those brutal offensive operations? The official military records confidently claim 500 enemy casualties, but those numbers almost entirely reflect surface engagements. What about the countless bodies forever trapped in deliberately collapsed sections, or the silent corpses rotting away in deep chambers that were never officially entered? The terrifying truth is that we genuinely do not know, and we likely never will know for sure. The final question profoundly connects the ghosts of Operation Crimp to absolutely every modern special operation conducted since that dark January. When we deliberately ask young soldiers to descend into pure hell for a fleeting tactical advantage, weaponize sheer fear, violate intimate sanctuaries, and hunt human beings in the pitch black, what exactly do we owe them when they finally come back? They won the underground war and changed military doctrine forever, but 17 of the 23 men tragically brought the crushing darkness back up to the surface with them, paying a price no metal can fix. If modern society is entirely unwilling to honestly answer that terrifying question or properly pay that massive moral debt, do we truly have the right to send them into the abyss in the first place? That is the deeply uncomfortable historical legacy nobody ever wants to talk about in the official command briefings. It is not about tactical brilliance or strategic dominance, but the profound human cost paid by men who became military legends, and somewhere beneath the silent earth of the hobo woods, in tunnels that still exist, that dark truth remains buried, but never forgotten.